Welcome back, and if you're just joining us, welcome to The Full View. Ethiopia says it did not compromise its national interest at talks with Egypt and Sudan over the operation of a power dam that it is constructing on the River Nile. The three countries met in Washington, D.C. from the 13th to the 15th of January and agreed that Ethiopia will fill the dam reservoirs of the Grand Renaissance Dam only during the wet season, July to August. SABC's Coletta Wanjohi looks at the row, which has Ethiopia on one side wanting to hasten the power production for its economic development, and Egypt, on the other hand, insisting any operation on the Nile will affect its lifeline.
The construction of the Grand Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia that began in 2011 has never stopped. That is despite ongoing disagreement between Egypt, Ethiopia and Sudan on the operation of the 6,000 megawatt dam on the River Nile. Ethiopia describes talks which concluded on 15th January in Washington, D.C. as positive. Many Ethiopian citizens are engaging the government officials who are part of the talks online, requesting for more details about the agreement, with some expressing fear that Ethiopia might have compromised too much. The government says technical and legal talks will proceed. It insists the filling of the $5 billion dam may take between 4 and 7 years, as was its earlier position in the talks. Jacob Arsano from Addis Ababa University says the dam is a matter of national pride for Ethiopia.
On part of Ethiopia, the dam is something which you cannot go back. Something Ethiopia would not, Ethiopia would consider even to stop it. And the Ethiopian public fully behind the dam because the public has been contributing a lot of money in the order of 12 billion Ethiopian birr. That's it's a big amount of money as far as public contribution is concerned, and a public will and public support.
Egypt still stands by the 1929 and 1959 colonial agreements with Britain that gave it 85% control of the River Nile. It has suggested that Ethiopia should take between 12 and 21 years to fill the dam. Egypt says that would reduce the possibility of less water flow downstream into its territory. The parties have agreed that Ethiopia fills its reservoirs only during the wet season in July and August. The dam is also expected to reduce flooding in Sudan. Water politics expert Professor Harry Verhoeven says there may be more beyond water needs.
Now, a key part of the problem here is a distributional question. It's about the question about who in Egypt actually controls the land and the water. Because a lot of the Egyptian government's narrative is about poor farmers being evicted of their land and no longer having water flow to their fields. But in reality, the overwhelming majority of water and of land are controlled either by the army directly or a series of companies that are associated with the security apparatus and with the army. And so then you begin to understand, of course, that this entire argument about Egypt potentially being brought to its knees and facing this kind of existential Malthusian crisis is not quite what is actually happening on the ground.
Professor Verhoeven adds that continuous dialogue among the parties and more legally supported actions by Ethiopia may lessen the tension between the two countries.
Now, Egypt can say, of course, oh, this dam is illegitimate, it is dangerous. Well, it's been constructed in Ethiopian territory. Ethiopia is well within its rights to do so. Ethiopia has provided information and has consulted Egypt, but ultimately this is an Ethiopian project. So if Ethiopia can get the internal politics right, it can finance the entire operation, get the technical details right, there should be no reason why they can't complete it. Now, of course, again, from the Ethiopian perspective, this is really a dam for regional purposes, and they really want to change the way the countries in the region relate to each other. It is best to do so by talking to the Egyptians.
The decision to have the United States take part in the talks came after Egypt reached out to Washington for mediation in 2019. It has since received criticism from some Africans who say, being the chair of the African Union, Egypt should have sought assistance within the continent. During his recent visit to South Africa, Ethiopia's Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed reached out to South Africa as the next chair for support in the process. Talks will resume on 28th and 29th of January in the hope of sealing an agreement on the operation of the dam. And whatever the outcome, Ethiopia says it is determined to produce its first phase of power this year. Coletta Wanjohi, SABC News, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia.
All right, well, for more on this story, we're joined by producer at Channel Africa, Izak Khomo. A very good evening to you, Mr. Khomo. Thank you so much for joining us here on The Full View. All right, so last week there was still a lot of tension between Ethiopia and Egypt, to the point where the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, who was here in South Africa on his official visit, in fact asked the South African President, our President Cyril Ramaphosa, to intervene. What has since happened since that time?
Well, I think what has been happening is that there have been talks which are taking place, as they say, in the USA. But the talks were there, but there were signs that the Egyptians were really adamant about the dam and the legality of the dam, not the legality as such, but the schedules for filling up the dam. But then, as you can see now, that they've reached a preliminary agreement where they're going to sit on the 28th of January to come and seal the agreement. Now, the thing which was actually the burning issue, it was not about the dam itself, although when it started being built, Egypt was totally against the building of the dam. But then the whole issue now just delved on technicalities, whereby on how long will the dam take to fill. Now, one thing about our listeners is that they should actually know what is actually at stake. Egypt, they say it's dependent upon the Nile waters, which is true. But then again, you find that with the Nile River in Egypt, over 80% of that water comes from the Blue Nile. And the Blue Nile is that Nile's tributary which comes from Ethiopia. The other tributary is the White Nile, which comes from East Africa via South Sudan. That contributes about 10 to 15% of the waters. Most of the waters end up in the Sad, which is a wetland. Now, with the dam, the Egyptians complain that, first of all, the Egyptians, they've got an agreement which they signed in 1929 with the British. This is the Anglo-Egyptian agreement on the use of the River Nile waters, whereby it was agreed that Egypt, it had the sole right to the waters of the River Nile. If any of the riverian countries, most of whom were British colonies, had they had to use the waters, they had to get the permission of Egypt. Now, that was a sticking point. Again, they had another agreement in 1959 between Egypt and Sudan. Sudan got its independence in 1956. And in that agreement, the two countries divided the shares. They gave each other shares of the River Nile, where Egypt, I think, it got about 55 billion cubic meters of water, whereas Sudan was given 14 billion. Yeah, and again, they actually specified that people could not have works on the River Nile without the permission of Egypt. But then you find that Ethiopia was never a British colony, so they're not even touched with the agreement of the Anglo-Egyptian agreement. But
so they're not forced to adhere to it, basically?
But they're not. But the Egyptians insist that they've got the right over the waters of the River Nile. Although the Egyptians also talk about the 1902 agreement on the use of the River Nile between Britain and Ethiopia. But then to that agreement, there is a misunderstanding, because there are two versions of that agreement, where the British agreement, the English version of the agreement, and the Ethiopian version of the agreement, they don't match, and they mean two different things. Yeah. So it's not been considered.
And you talk about this preliminary agreement that has been signed, but of course, as always, the devil is in the details. I mean, we heard last week Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed of Ethiopia saying that what he wants really is a win-win situation regarding the Nile. If you look at this preliminary agreement, could this possibly be a win-win situation? I mean, at the end of the day, there are questions still about, the bigger question, and as I said, the devil being in the detail, about how Ethiopia will then operate this Renaissance dam.
Yeah, that's it. You see, because Egypt, as you can see, that it's a fait accompli that the dam is there.
Yeah.
So now it's just operation of the dam and how the dam will be filled. Yeah. The thing is this, that that dam has got to be filled slowly so that it does not affect the downstream flow of the waters, which Egypt is dependent upon, and also Sudan is dependent upon. But again, you find that Egypt has got the Aswan Dam. Now, with the Aswan Lake, Lake Nasser, that Lake Nasser, it has got a quantity of waters which is equivalent to 2-season or 3-season Nile flow. So therefore, they've got a huge reservoir of water.
Yeah.
But even though they're just complaining that they want to maintain their reservoir. Now, the filling of the dam is crucial because once you fill the dam too fast, you are going to cut off the water which flows out. So now just to keep the flow on, they're going to fill it in the rainy season. Yeah.
And just on that, Ethiopia is saying that only during the rainy seasons will they fill up this dam.
Yeah.
And this then means that there will be flooding prevented in Egypt, from what I understand. Is that not a win for the other countries, though?
Well, you see, the flooding issue about the flooding of the River Nile, basically it has long been solved since there are quite a number of dams. There are 2 dams on the Nile in Sudan.
Yeah.
Yeah. And also there is this Aswan Dam. So basically that flooding, the traditional flooding, it was long controlled. The issue here is just about the water, quantities of water. And again, the Egyptians, they say that because Ethiopia, they've also got other other ideas for the river, for the Nile waters, that they want to get into irrigation. Yeah, there will be a lot of irrigation projects. You should remember that Ethiopia is susceptible to a very serious drought. And with those droughts, people die in millions. Yeah? And again, they're going to go for power generation. And in that power generation, they've got agreements with Sudan, where part of the power is going to be actually sold to Sudan. Yeah? So that is those are developmental programs. But then Egypt is being intransigent because the riverian countries, which actually are connected to the River Nile, which are Rwanda, Burundi, DRC, Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda, and South Sudan, they've actually come and sat together and they invited Egypt to come and sit, Egypt and Sudan, so that they have a riverian, Nile riverian conference where they're going to have equitable use of the River Nile. Now, Egypt is adamant that they're not interested in that. They want to go back to the old 1920 agreements between themselves and the British, which British does not make sense.
They're no longer a colony.
Yeah, exactly. Because you say that thing there, people tend to point out to the Egyptians that they have had an agreement whereby the Suez Canal, it was British property. Yet in 1956, they actually nationalized it and it became Egyptian. So why should you stick to colonial agreements?
So when it suits the Egyptians, they want to go back to colonial rules. But, interestingly, as we sort of watch this conflict, and I'm going to call it a conflict going on, there's been some analysis about the fact that the next water conflict war is going to come because of water. And as we look at this, it's interesting to think, could this be what commentators have been saying all along, that the next, apart from what Trump is saying on the other end and his actions, but people have been saying that the next war is going to be because of water. Do you think that this is in fact that war?
In fact, it has already started. You see, because I'm not talking about Egypt, two national conflicts. Yeah, that thing they could actually get into that type of conflict. Yeah. But I mean to say that the next conflict will be over resources which are diminishing. We can see it in the Sahel. Yeah, in the Sahel, you've got the pastoralists due to global warming, and the change in weather and climate. Is this that the pastoralists are moving south to areas where they never used to graze their flocks, but these are agricultural areas, and there are conflicts. There are there in Sudan, in the Darfur area, they're there in the Sahel, in Nigeria, That's why they're coming, they're fighting over the scant resources and water. And of course, as for the River Nile, Egypt has got two armies. They had an army of the Suez, which was facing Israel. They had a southern army that people don't know about. They used to call it the army of the North. It's a huge army. And in the Egyptian constitution, they've got a clause which says that Egypt is ready to go to war with any nation that is going to stop the flow of the River Nile. Yeah, so basically they're even prepared to for war, and that's in their constitution. But whether they can actually carry out that war, it's a big question. But again, you find that Egypt, the River Nile is not the only source of water that Egypt has got. Egypt has got huge reserves of aquifers, yeah? Resources. Aquifers are underground, fossil water, which spread from almost the Nile Valley, which goes right into Ethiopia. Yeah. No, sorry, right into Libya. All the way there's got huge quantities of water underground, just as Libya's got the same thing. Yeah, so basically, I mean to say, it's no point going to war. It's just a matter of agreeing and whatnot. And also Egypt using other resources that they've got as far as water is concerned. They can green the desert from those aquifers.
All right, Izak Khomo, great pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much for that in-depth information and analysis. No doubt we will continue to be talking on this issue. We appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.